Something I hear often is that tanking is an intimidating role, especially in Mythic Plus. Back in the day, tanking was simply get hit and stay alive. While dungeoneering has advanced in this game, so has the expectations of tanks having knowledge of 5-man content. Not only are you expected to keep threat by executing and favoring damage, but you're also expected to stay alive and be fairly self-reliant through mitigation and self-healing. Since the introduction of Mythic Plus and the meta adaptations, there's an immense amount of pressure for the tank to understand not only their own class, but also the dungeon routing, what's most efficient, how to cater to your DPS's cooldowns, track man on your healer, the ideal way to handle and maneuver bosses, and the list goes on and on. While I often see people commenting about, how do I get into tanking? Or tanking makes me nervous, how do I get more comfortable? In a bunch of different people's Twitch chats and the YouTube comment section alike, both my channel and others, I never really thought I'd make a video about it. There are a variety of answers, and while I do like the simple answer, you just gotta do it and get your toes wet, there's definitely a lot more a new tank can do to get comfortable. And in this video, I'm going to give you guys a few tips for tanking in Dragonflight, and I hope they help. This suggestion actually came from one of my Patreon supporters, Linus. Huge shout out to him and all my other supporters over there on that platform. Patreon supporters get access to specific channels in my Discord, as well as all my week ore packages, noted dungeon routes, coaching, and more. I normally don't plug my channel like this, but I figured I'd at least mention it. Anyways, let's dive in. I think this goes without saying. Finding a tank that you enjoy will make the process of tanking much easier for you. If you enjoy the class, you obviously enjoy playing it. In my experience, enjoyment breeds comfort, and at a much faster pace. You don't always need to play what is deemed meta by the community, and in all reality, since I would say probably Shadowlands Season 2, the tank balance has actually been pretty much the best we've ever seen, and it's continuing to look that way going into Dragonflight. Also, when you enjoy the class you're playing, more often than not it'll make you want to learn more about the class and all the little small nuances that it carries. For example, learning what spells you can spell reflect on the warrior, or maybe a way to optimize your CC effects like paralysis and Ring of Peace on the monk. I know this is a cop-out answer, but honestly, play the tank and class you wholeheartedly enjoy. Now, this is a big one. Mythic Dungeon Tools is one of the best add-ons that you can use as a tank, and it's relatively expected for tank players to know how to operate this add-on. If you haven't used it before, it's an add-on that'll show you a map layout for each dungeon, the mobs it contains with patrol routing, abilities that the mobs cast, the CC it's affected by, if the mobs have Spectral Sight or not, the amount of health each mobs have, and once again the list goes on and on. The most important thing here is being able to plan routes and maximize your mob percentage. In a time-based instance, you want to minimize the extra amount of trash that you pull, since it'll only eat away at your timer. The closer you can get this to 100% without being under, the better. More often than not, websites like Raider.io will have basic routes for you, so no need to make them all yourself. If you want though, you and your group can definitely figure out a way to change and optimize the route depending on your composition. Something else that I do want to note here is that some tanks who use this add-on for the first time say that they have a hard time remembering the route, and they hate having to constantly reopen the add-on. First, this comes with practice, but the more you run an instance, the more comfortable you will be with the routing and what to pull, but I'm going to talk about that more in a second. My other suggestion is simply just take a screenshot of your route and the pulls, and maybe throw it up on your second monitor. For those who don't have a second monitor, something that I did back in the day when I was playing on a good old gaming laptop was just take a good old-fashioned sticky note. I wrote down the percentages that I need for each section of the dungeon, and then I stuck it to the edge of my computer screen. While not as easy as throwing a screenshot on the second monitor, it allowed me to at least break up the routes, and eventually I would learn to just get a second monitor. This section is somewhat odd because it is a variety of tips in like one. So much for the whole 5 tips title. First things first, I recommend just looking up guides for each dungeon. You can find a handful of content creators talking about these. One of my favorite is Dratnos, who also puts out his routes on Raider.io. I'll have his information linked below as well as the Raider.io site. Other players like myself will also typically post guides or commentaries about their runs. These are great because it'll also let you get insight in how they plan, execute, and think about their route. Which will lead me to my next little tip in this section, which is just watch other tanks play. I'll have a list of great tanks down in the description as well. Personally, I love watching Dorky, Pika, and Equinox. They're all super knowledgeable and typically stream a fair bit. If you know of any other tank streamer though, let me know in the comments below. I can always add them to the description. There are also some other great website resources out there. Sites like Greater.io, as I previously mentioned. There's also Mythic Plus Sub Creation, Tank Notes, and Wowhead. These are all great tools that I frequently use, whether I'm looking for tips, data, or just general guides. I will have a list of all of these linked below, and they're also in my Discord server. Lastly, this is something a lot of people forget about, but the Dungeon Journal. I know, crazy, but the Dungeon Journal actually provides a lot of information to players, and I personally think it's underutilized. It's a good way to read about each boss encounter in the dungeon, and I know what to look out for. If you ever wonder how guide writers and content creators actually know so much about the dungeons, it's because they learned how to read. I know this is a lot of information, but basically just absorb as much information as you can from every resource that's available, both in the game and outside of the game. This should go without saying, but if you're not comfortable diving into a key right away, then don't. All tanks started somewhere, and most of the time when you guys see these dudes pushing right at the start of a season, they're mostly just beta players who have all of these dungeons already figured out. Back when I started tanking in Battle for Azeroth, in order to learn routes, I started actually in Mythic Zeros and very low keys. This can help you learn the basics of a dungeon without any type of risk. Especially in the first 2 weeks of Dragonflight, Mythic Plus won't be available, so run some heroics and some M0s to get your toes wet and start paying attention to the timings of the fight. For tanks who start later in the season, it's the same principle. In lower level content, bosses are less threatening, thrash won't be as cumbersome, and typically there are less affixes to deal with, so you can focus on learning the basics before adding any higher level risk. Then, after a few reps, and probably a few wipes, you'll start getting the hang of it, and then you can start pushing. The last tip isn't really a tip, it's more of a fact. Have you ever heard of a good old saying, practice makes perfect? Well, it does. Not really, but the more you play your class, run specific dungeons, use add-ons, and do research, the better you'll be. All of this will come second nature. If you look at any top player, the one thing the majority of them have in common is just reps. They have a ridiculous amount of runs for each dungeon. While you can't be expected to run 1,000+ dungeons per season, each run you do will make the task a little bit easier. It doesn't even have to be dungeons. I will often utilize training dummies as a way to test out talents or parts of my rotation or just trinkets in general. When I can't currently play the game but have some free time, sometimes I like to use sites like Keystone Guru to experiment with routes, or I'll read a dungeon guide on Wowhead. I could keep going in circles here if I don't cut myself off, but basically, time and practice will lead to comfort, which will lead to performance. One last side tip though, tanks are the referees of World of Warcraft. You're going to be either unnoticed or you're going to be hated. You'll have to have thick skin for this role since you're often blamed first in any type of situation, but at the same time you're also the backbone of the group, so carry that with pride. Don't let toxicity discourage you, especially if it comes from a rogue who doesn't use tricks of the trade or basically any arcane mage. Those guys are the worst. Tanking can be very complex, yet extremely enjoyable and rewarding. I hope this video was at least a little useful. My channel is centered around tanking and Mythic Plus content, so if you made it this far, show that like and subscribe button a little love. Also, let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, or if I missed anything that you would like to add. I'm sure people in the comment section would be grateful. Again, huge shout out to Linus and my other Patreons. Without them, there'd be a lot less of, well, whatever you call this. I hope you're all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.